So welcome to the third in our three-part webinar series on capital campaigns. A couple weeks ago, we started out talking about what a capital campaign is and if it's right for your congregational's needs. After that, we talked about feasibility studies, the all-important tool for determining if your congregation has the energy and investment in the process of a capital campaign, and also what you can expect to raise in that campaign. And then today we're really going to take a detailed look at the campaign work itself, month by month. So thank you for being here. I'm Tracy Meppy, and I serve the diocese in the role of faith formation and development and stewardship.
And I'm Paul Alexander, Missioner for Development and Financial Stewardship, and it's great to be with you. And it's great to have Dennis Green, who's the CEO and President of Church Development. Dennis has been working with us on all these webinars and really been a great resource for the diocese and for many dioceses all around the country. And Dennis, I have to say that the resources that you provided on your website and your book, The Stewardship System, has been so good that I had a rector talk to me the other day, and he said, "Why do I need Dennis? Because I got all these great resources that tell me exactly what to do." And I followed it, and we've been super successful. So you got to be careful about putting all that stuff out there, because it's just been such a great resources for, I know, people around our diocese, that you might put yourself out of a job. But Dennis, it's great.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love to retire. Well, it is a pleasure to share all of that information. You know, we've been keeping track of all the things that we've learned over the past 20-something years, and more than 100 church capital campaigns and thousands of church annual campaigns. So we've kind of developed a pretty good body of knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. But like anything, it does require a human being to implement it. So I've got a ton of information and guidance, and God bless you for going forward to implement the activities, because it does work. But to run a capital campaign, you can expect for somebody to spend 700 hours. And we're about to show you where those 700 hours would be spent with our detailed walkthrough. So Paul and Tracy, I will follow your lead as we proceed.
That's great. We have one participant who's having audio issues, so we're going to work hard to resolve that issue. But I wanted to let participants know that the content of the webinar will take about 30 minutes, and we'll have 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. But if at any time during the presentation you have a question you want to put out there before you forget it, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and type in your message. And we'll make sure we get to it during that Q&A session.
And as always, we'll start with a prayer, and maybe the first prayer will be that everybody can hear the audio and listen to us. But the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
O God, whose glory it is always to have mercy, be gracious to all who long for you, and bring them again to embrace and hold fast to the love and mercy of your word, Jesus Christ, your Son, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns one God forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
So during the course of the webinar, we're really going to look at each of the campaign activities on a month-by-month basis. Over the course of 6 months. It's a fairly intensive process. We're going to pay particular attention to the budget, to the gifts that you might be able to expect in your congregation, and then the training and recruitment of leadership and volunteers.
So Dennis, just to start, can you kind of walk us through the first month? You know, how do you start all this off? Walk us through that first month of the campaign.
Well, absolutely. So really, before the activity begins, it's a very good idea to conduct a pretty thorough analysis of your circumstances and of your members, to find out what do people think and how do they feel about proceeding. So that first month really is all about the feasibility study. So in that feasibility study, we would want to interview a cross-section of the active members of your church. I learned a new term from Malcolm Gladwell. It's mavens. It's the opinion leaders. We want to know, what do people think and how do they feel about moving ahead with a capital campaign. So we've done more than 100 congregational campaigns, and we haven't found one yet where there is a perfect 100% alignment, where everybody agrees about everything. So if you don't have 100% perfect alignment, don't be upset. As long as you have a high majority and the key term here really would be consensus. So not everyone could get everything that they want, but do they feel comfortable proceeding down the path with which the vestry has designed and plotted out for the course? We would also survey all members, so literally give everybody a chance to give input. And I would say, even let's reach out to people who are visitors, who have ever visited the church over the past couple of years. We want to know what they think. It's an unusual trend going on right now, but people might be visitors to a church for years and never join. Well, we still want to involve them, regardless of their lack of interest in the formality of joining. So we would compile all the information, analyze it, compare you to 100 other similar churches, and then prepare a set of specific recommendations. And that really would help you tailor the campaign to the unique personality of your church. Sometimes when you do this survey, the answer is no, do not proceed, but rather go back and address concerns that have been identified during the feasibility study. So it takes about a month, maybe 6 weeks. But boy, that's extremely important. That is a really important place to begin. It's like an X-ray before surgery.
But don't you even begin before that, as far as you don't sort of spring all this on them, right? I mean, how do you engage the folks before, before this actual feasibility? Is there a step, kind of a pre-step before that?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up, Paul. Consensus around the vision is extremely important, and it might take you a year to gather that consensus. So I would recommend not only the vestry, but perhaps a planning committee to begin looking at the long term and really gathering input from the congregation all the way through the process, so there is some clarity around the church vision, and then second, around what would we be spending this money on, from which the capital campaign would generate these funds. So there has to be consensus on the plan and a first draft of where those funds would go before you do that feasibility study. Thank you for bringing that up, Paul. We would never want to surprise anybody, but really take as many months as needed in advance to organize consensus.
Thanks.
Well, it seems like moving into this work, budget is also something key to consider. Could you talk a little bit more about what an actual campaign costs?
Yes, I will. But can I go back just a second to the gift range chart? I kind of skipped by that. The gift range chart really is a profile of what the stratification of gifts might look like in a campaign. And everyone is familiar with the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. And that approximately matches how gifts will probably flow into your campaign. You know, the norm is to have probably one gift that's going to be 10% of the total that you raise, and 10, maybe a dozen gifts that equal about 40%. So you're probably going to have just around a dozen donors who will give about half of all the money that is raised. Now, the number proceeds, with the more numbers, the more the structure of a pyramid begins to emerge. And that part of that is due to the natural stratification of wealth in our society today. And part of it is due to engagement. So we find that the more a person is engaged in the life of the church, the more generous they will be. The more they've been active as a volunteer, the more they've been involved in decisions, and the more they've been connected socially. So when Paul asked that question about what happens in advance, those three factors are very important to start planning in advance, perhaps a year in advance of your feasibility study. And who should you invite to be involved? Well, everybody. But this gift range chart will just help you become aware of how those gifts will probably flow. Now, forgive me for taking a step. We can step on. You see, the national average for all capital campaigns is that it costs about 10% of the amount raised. And there's been a great deal of research on this. Now, what would be normal, and you can see under that first bullet, is that it'd be normal to raise 2 to 3 times annual giving in a congregational campaign. Now, that's if it's professionally run. We also keep track of do-it-yourself campaigns. They usually raise about 20% of annual giving. So you can see right away, if you do a thorough professional job, you will raise more money. So that's what we recommend. Do the best job possible. Now, point 3 will tell you how much are we going to spend. It's going to be somewhere between 5% and 15% of the amount that we raise. The national average is right in there, about 10%. We keep track on that for us as well. Our average over the past 100 campaigns is that our expense has been about 4%. So for every dollar we're paid, we raise about $25. Now, we are not allowed to charge a percentage. The Association of Fundraising Professionals has in their code that thou shalt not do that. So you're going to spend about 10%. And one of the ways to think about it is, you know, how much are we going to spend per family in our capital campaigns? Because you are going to spend some funds on newsletters, brochures, mailings. You're going to spend money on food. You're going to have lots of events. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot of activity going on. And then there's kind of a hidden cost too. It is going to take some staff time. So if you hire a resident consultant who's going to be there a lot, your staff time will be minimized. If you do it yourself, you know, somebody is really going to have to spend that 700 and perhaps more hours to do, to really focus on the completion of those campaign tasks. It's a really good question, and everybody ought to be worried about that up front. Thank you for asking us.
Great.
And just out of curiosity on on that gift chart item, do you know at the end of the feasibility study kind of who those people are that are going to give half the campaign? Is that where you find that out?
Usually in a feasibility study, people are very direct. The answer is yes, first of all. And usually in a feasibility study, people are very direct. And we do ask that question. We do say those words. We say, this is an anonymous feasibility study survey, but we would like a litmus test response to the money question. If the campaign were to be held tomorrow, what amount would you consider giving? This is not a pledge. This is anonymous. And then we look very carefully at that number. So those people tend to self-identify then. And then a question later on, we ask, would you consider being a servant as an active volunteer and helping to lead the capital campaign? And they usually identify then as well. And then we ask a third question, who might be good leaders in our capital campaign? So we look at all those 3 things, and the leadership emerges quite early on to discover who really cares about this, who's willing to lead both financially and as being a leadership volunteer.
Well, that sounds like a great segue into talking about how to recruit volunteers.
Well, we do ask that question, if you'd be willing to be a volunteer, and we list those different committees upon which a person could volunteer. And we just completed a feasibility study yesterday for a congregation of about 500 people, and I think we had 61 volunteers. So we identify them in the feasibility study, and then we also invite everybody again to come to the volunteer organizational meeting that's going to happen in month 2. And we would hope to get twice that many. We want maximum involvement. And we know that at the core, about 15% of any church is going to volunteer to serve on a standing committee, but 85% is not. So we're going to design our campaign activities to be of an episodic nature so that the newbie or the marginally involved could possibly volunteer for something they might enjoy, but see that it might only take 3 or maybe 4 committee meetings, and then they're done. So what my experience has been is that's a little bit like a one-way valve. When people join, they make new friends, discover that it's fun, and that's a segue to other volunteer activities within the church. So you could consider it a leadership development activity. Now, we kind of recommend 6 committees, seem to be the right formula: prayer event, thanks, youth ambassador, and communication. And if we can get those 6 committees going, then we can tailor the campaign to the unique personality of the church. Everybody gets a manual, and they get a calendar and all kinds of support and resource material. So they're not having to lead this thing blind, but they're quite well informed and trained and prepared as well.
Dennis, I'm intrigued by the youth bullet. What are ways that youth could get involved in this process?
Well, we call it the McDonald's factor. If the youth are involved, their parents will follow. So we do not expect to raise any money, but if the youth have a car wash or pennies from heaven or bring your dollar in on a particular Sunday, everyone enjoys their presence and worship and sees their interest in investing in the life of their church. And it's very fun. It's very fun. And, the secondary benefit is perhaps even more important than generating enthusiasm. And that is to help the youth understand what is stewardship, that God has blessed us with everything that we have, and we are meant to be a conduit for God's blessing. So if they can learn that young, they will have a much happier life for the remainder of their lifetimes.
Great, thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about the kind of the leadership structure that you create to make this happen? You've kind of got the committees there, but who's in charge?
Right. So beyond the prayer event, thanks, youth ambassador, and communication, you've got to have kind of a servant committee, which we call the management team. And it'd be great if we could have the rector and church business administrator, a vestry leader. It does not have to be the senior warden. That would be nice, but it would be nice to have a person on the vestry, and your campaign consultant, and perhaps another big picture thinker. This management team meeting would really meet on a weekly or every other week basis to keep an eye on all of the details. Now, beyond that, we would also suggest that you have an advisory group, which is much larger and does not focus on details, but focuses on the big picture. So they would act like the board of directors of the capital campaign. They'd only have to come to 3 meetings over the course of the campaign, but this advisory or executive group would help us really set policy and determine direction for the campaign. Again, it's just another method for making sure that we tailor this to the unique characteristics of the church, because one size does not fit all. Now, at the bottom of that slide, 5B, we talk about it. A positive attitude is very important. And if we ever have a choice, we would prefer an optimist to a pessimist. And skepticism is a healthy thing, but generally an optimistic attitude helps the work flow better.
I'm curious, in looking at the leadership and the volunteer committees, it seems like one thing is missing, and that's the person who would maybe have the construction expertise or architectural background, who could make sure that we're not randomly doing projects that might not benefit us longer term, who might own that big picture thinking about how these changes are going to be incorporated and absorbed into the big picture of the church.
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, that is such a big question that we really recommend that function, that construction, management, and budget function, have not just a person, but a committee in charge of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these are 2 very different sets of skills: construction, management, and budget of facility construction versus the stewardship and fundraising activities. So in a corporate sector, one might say this would be a finance mindset and this would be a sales or marketing mindset. it's rare that skills would be shared by one person who would be very good at both of those things. So we want to make sure that your question is addressed by having a leader and a committee to figure all that stuff out and hand the information off to the campaign committee. That's a great question. And usually, a lot of times we find that reversed in an annual campaign where a finance committee will take up the stewardship function for a month every year. And they're not the best people to do that. They're oriented towards, managing finances, not towards marketing. So we really recommend you have a stewardship committee that is just focused on stewardship, and they are separate from a finance committee. That's a good point.
Great. All right, so we've got all sorts of volunteers now. How do we go about getting them organized and trained?
Well, that pie chart there tells you, the point I made a moment ago is that about 15% of your people are ready, willing, and able to be on a committee. And we really want to look beyond those. So we want to publicize the heck out of our 6 different committees and describe what they will do and encourage everybody to join to find something that they resonate with. And once they do, so we're going to expand way beyond that initial 15% who volunteers for everything. And once we identify those, then on the next slide, you'll see we're going to spend a lot of time training them. So everybody gets a manual. There are video guides, there are printed pieces, and there are samples from 100 other churches that they can access and modify and tailor. So we would meet with those people in advance, and then we would want to have a kickoff meeting, a volunteer organization meeting, where we would invite everybody in the whole church to gather. The best time, in my opinion, is right after the last service on Sunday. Buy everybody a meal, and then have a presentation to everybody as a whole for 15 or 20 minutes, and then break up into these 6 different working teams. And the leaders would have been trained in advance. They'd have their manuals, checklists, calendars, samples, so they could hit the ground running right at that moment. Your volunteer effectiveness is very important for the success of your campaign.
That's good. And what about the rector? I mean, doesn't the priest need to really be in charge of this? And what kind of role does he or she hold?
Well, I think probably every rector that's watching has got that same question on their mind. We want to not burn the rector out. We do not want to dump all of this labor on the clergy. To preserve their role as the spiritual leader of the congregation is very important. So we want their guidance and advice. It would be great if we could have their input in our management team meetings every other week so they know what's going on, but we don't want to burden them. So they need to keep the focus on our shared values, our mission, our vision, and to equip and train people to engage in prayer, to discern God's will in their life. And we will ask them to attend events. We want them to open events, and maybe we would invite somebody from the facilities committee to come present what we want to raise money for. How are we going to change or improve the church? Let's get a construction expert on that. We want them to know what's going on in our publications, and we would draft their columns for them and ask them to improve those. But we want people to see that they are endorsing the project. We would like them to attend visits with donors. They don't have to ask, but we would like their presence at those activities. And then to share the leadership function with the lay volunteers so that people would see our rector is involved and embracing this. They don't have to be the person at the head of the room at the podium at all times, but their presence speaks volumes. But we definitely don't want to burn them out.
Good, thank you.
All right, so it seems like a plan is in place and the volunteers have been organized. What happens next?
I've kind of skipped. I haven't said much about communication, but the communication is enormous, and there has to be so much of a flow That's really got to start at the end of that feasibility study. We've got to send out a print newsletter, a piece of paper. Now, a lot of churches have gone paperless, but this is so important. We want everybody to have in their hand, what did we learn from the survey of our people? And that really begins the avalanche of information flow outward. So there'll be newsletters, videos, emails, social media, Sunday bulletins, Sunday announcements. The amount of information that's flowing outward is enormous. We think that it'll take a person maybe 200 hours to manage all of that during the process. So everybody knows about the feasibility study. Everybody knows about the volunteer activities that are coming up. And now in month 3, people will know about these campaign activities that we're calling Communicate the Vision, Build Community, and Cultivate Stewards. We want to have a series of social activities in which people discover greater detail about the plan, but they are not asked for a gift. So we want that building committee, that building person who's an expert, to come show us the architectural drawings and show us the budget and answer a lot of questions. And the role of the rector at those events would be to open and welcome with prayer, and then conclude by saying, please pray about how you might participate. In the near future, you will be receiving a request for support. But we really want to set up those events as a method for which every person can get their questions answered. So I've been through about 1 million of these, and they're very pleasant. They build morale. They're socially connecting experiences. So they're very fun.
Great. Cool. So did you have one event that just sticks out in your head that was like the most creative, fun, Episcopalian event?
Well, I tell you, I feel like I've seen about everything. I saw one where the events committee person was just convinced that they had a room full of $1 million donors, and they were a significant donor. So they said they would put the bill and they would spend $100 per person on the event.
Oh.
And this made my head explode. This just seemed like such a high risk activity. It seemed nuts. So it turned out they were wrong, but not by much. The average gift of those 10 people at that dinner with the rector and the building committee turned out to be $500,000 per person.
Oh.
I would never, ever recommend such opulence. As a matter of fact, I would kind of recommend the opposite. I think a spaghetti dinner or cookies and punch after services or Subway sandwiches would be just fine with most people. So people really come for the camaraderie, and they really want to know what's going on. So I would tend to make it kind of low key and fun. The worst one, I'll tell you, I ever participated in was a St. Patrick's Day event where everything was green. And there was a lot of stained teeth and green fingers after that. Oh, golly.
No, thanks. So what comes after this? You talked a lot about the importance of prayer, and and it seems like it's really key not only to be centered, obviously, in prayer, but how do you help people really deeply discern, how much they can stretch, if this really is where they're called to give? I mean, it seems like there's the praying, but there's also this deep discernment. How do you go about helping people do that?
Well, in my opinion, this is the high point of the campaign. And what our hope is that people learn from their clergy person techniques and methods of prayer and discernment. And then we hope they implement that for every decision in the rest of their life. That's our hope, that we model out discernment right at this moment. Now, we don't want to exert pressure. We do not want to fill out a pledge card and hand it to somebody and say, I will wait while you make a pledge. That is a guaranteed way to have people quit the church, which is a disaster. So I think the right way to proceed is ask people to pray their way through it. So the prayer team will create a campaign prayer, and then they will also complete a prayer guide, which might be a 14-day guide. So I've got one author per day, 3 or 4 paragraphs with some scripture about how they have discerned God's will in their life and how much they care for the church. So each person, each author will have an interesting, unique story, and we want that to build up to the Commitment Sunday. So the discernment process should be a topic that we talk about all the way through, and we equip people with resources to do that. So you remember that the average Episcopalian just gives about 2% of their income to their church. And when we work at stewardship efforts, we're able to increase that by perhaps 10% per year. But in a campaign of this magnitude, a capital campaign, we really do hope people double their giving for 3 years. And that should not be taken lightly. We really do say the word. This might be the largest single charitable gift of your lifetime. So please talk about it with each other and then discern. Take this into your time of prayer. Now, we feel very confident that if a person does indeed take this into a time of prayer, that the right thing will come out of it. We are pretty sure that is going to happen. So we talk about it a lot, and then we equip, and then we set a time aside for that. So it's very formal and very organized.
Thanks.
Well, Dennis, when I first saw this time frame, I thought, wow, this is a really long time to get to the point of asking for pledges. But I love the way it's intentional and that it's not pressured, and can see the huge benefit to taking all this time. So in month 5 is, and here we are.
Well, so Tracy, I mean, your point is well taken, and the metaphor comes to mind of farming. And if a person considers farming to only be gathering in the harvest, then one really is missing about 90% of what is farming. And maybe it is maturity that would help one understand that the amount of time you devote in advance will have a direct correlation on your success at harvest.
Mm-hmm.
But old-time fundraising was just absolutely barbaric, where people would, I mean, 100 years ago, a capital campaign like this really meant door-to-door with a pledge card that's already filled out. And some denominations still do that today. They check your tax form and say, you need to give 10%. I think that's a bad idea. If we can build in engagement, decision-making, tailoring, prayer, all those things before commitment weekend, you're not just going to have a big fund, 2 to 3 times annual giving in your capital campaign fund, but your annual giving will probably go up by 10% that following year. You'll have more volunteerism. You'll have greater morale in the church. So the build up to month 5 is really a very important thing, and I would not eliminate those previous 4 months. Now, month 5, it's a very interesting thing. You have to announce that we are going to have a formal and official Commitment Sunday, even though your lead donors are going to give early. And we will announce in advance that we have a dozen donors who have stepped up in advance, and maybe we're halfway to our goal already. That momentum helps. There's a researcher named Caldini, and his book is about persuasion. He's a social science researcher, and he just came out with a new book called Persuasion. Instead of persuasion, the persuasion is about all the activities that must happen before one seeks to engage and invite somebody to make a decision. So the theorists say preparation is the large part of the work as well. So we have a Commitment Sunday that has a date. Even when you have a date, about half the people miss it, and they say, what was happening? Even though every Sunday we talk about it. And they've received videos and brochures and mailings and been to an event. They say, what's going on? So you have to have that Commitment Sunday, and you want people to pray before it. But on that Commitment Sunday, you do announce today is Commitment Sunday, and you will have banners up, and there'll be activities, and there'll be a way for a person to take their pledge card and do something with it meaningfully. But it's the follow-up after that that's really going to make a big impact. In advance, we do want to hand everybody a packet, and we do want to contact them either in person or by phone and ask them, do you have any questions that I might address? You do want to have a big deal on your Commitment Sunday. After Commitment Sunday, we want to follow up and we want to celebrate and let everybody know, hey, half the congregation is on board. We're moving ahead with our capital campaign. We'd like 100%. So each Sunday afterwards, we're announcing our momentum. You remember the old-fashioned thermometers? That's really a pretty good idea. So we want to somehow communicate things are looking great. We are marching ahead, and we want you to participate. Now, it's kind of funny, but for some people, how they will be thanked actually has an impact on their giving, which is kind of a weird thing, but to be pragmatic, we should plan that in advance too.
So that's really that month 6 where you're mailing out thank you letters and you're doing all that and thinking clearly about how different people would like to get thanked in different ways, right? Some love a little gift, others just want a quiet thank you, and others might like a nice dinner or something like that, right? So there's different ways that people respond, but the main thing is you got to thank you, right?
Oh, that's absolutely right. So from my experience, I think about 15% of the people do not want to be thanked, just period. Don't thank me, spend the money on something else. But I was in a meeting on Wednesday where we had a lead donor who was just sort of direct and kind of wanting to know, well, are we going to be allowed to name something? And I thought, well, by golly, we're not going to change the name of the church, but we could certainly name the education wing after whoever you would like to name that for. So some people really, that's a big deal. And we don't want to bend the rules of a church or to destroy anything, but we sure want to accommodate if they have an interest, if it is at all possible. Most people are very happy to receive a gift like you've got pictured at the bottom of this slide. Like my personal favorite is a Christmas tree ornament that has in which the church is portrayed. Because every year I'll bring it back out, hang it on the tree, and just be joyful that this is a meaningful institution in my life that has given me a lot. So I like a modest $5 or $10 gift. And I think you ought to be really careful about giving stratified gifts. So people who give over $10,000 get something special. I think in the church world, we got to be really delicate about how we approach that. So generally, I say one gift for everybody, kind of modest, like a Christmas tree ornament. Some people will make 2 pledges so they can get 2 of them. It's kind of hilarious.
And I've been really fortunate because I've had a lot of churches that have renamed themselves after me, St. Paul. It's amazing, how grateful I am as I walk in and see that.
I was in your cathedral just the other day.
Yeah, well, it's really, I've just been full of gratitude today.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, golly.
Well, I actually have 2 questions following on from this slide. One is, what does campaign follow-up look like? I know the process doesn't stop here. And also, what percentage of pledges are typically fulfilled? I mean, I would think that has to be factored into the budget process.
It sure does. There is a direct correlation between pressure, prayer, and pledge collection. The more pressure you exert, the lower your pledge collection will be. The more prayer you focus on, the higher pledge collection is going to be. So we want this to be a prayer-focused pledge process. And in that case, you'll probably collect 95% of what is pledged. Now, if it's pressure-oriented, where it's door-to-door and we're not going to leave till we get a pledge card, 80% would be a more realistic expectation. Now, the 3-year follow-through is pretty important because you really need to communicate with people on a quarterly basis where their donated funds have gone, what has happened. So we've got to have a dedicated follow-through team that we support for those 3 years. We convene them quarterly to check in on pledge collections, to plan communication that's going out. And then we're also going to do a couple things that might not occur to a normal person. Not that I'm saying fundraisers are abnormal, but we kind of are. We know that about 10 to 15% of your people are going to be one-time donors, and they're going to say this is a one-time gift. A year later, we're going to come back to them with a letter and say, thank you for that one-time gift. Would you consider a second one-time gift? And most of them say yes. And then a year after that, we'll do a third ask and say, thank you for your first 2 one-time gifts. Would you consider a third one-time gift? Here's how that money would be used. And that would usually happen. So over the 3 years, that's another thing that we would do. Another activity would be when you have new people join the church, we would ask them if they would like to make a pledge. That would conclude at the same time as everybody else. So if somebody joined a year later, we'd ask them to make a 2-year pledge. So by a combination of a couple of these activities, we can and do achieve 100% of that which is originally pledged. So that I'm happy to report that. Now, another thing that we do in the 3-year follow-up is we would like people to remember the church and their estate plans. Now, we've discovered, it's the lessons from behavioral economics. There's a guy who got a Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He helped me better understand if a person is going to make a pledge to a capital campaign here, they're highly likely to make an estate gift 12 months later. They want to ensure that their first gift was well invested. So we follow up 12 months after Commitment Sunday, and we ask people to remember the church and their estate plans. And our hope is to gather in the same dollar amount of estate intentions as we gather in capital campaign pledges. That's our target, and frequently we do hit that. It's very gentle. We equip them with knowledge. But in a way, it's kind of a ministry because we know that 70% of everybody dies without an estate plan. And it would be great if they did have an estate plan. Well, we can help with that. We can equip them. The Episcopal Foundation has a lot of really good resources that we can just give them. But really, they need more of that. They need to be organized, and there needs to be a benefit and a timeline. And that's all part of that 3-year follow-up activity.
I know we're about out of time here, but I have one question. One thing we often get from many parishes is, we have a lot of transient populations, and military families moving on, or people that are retiring and moving to Florida. How do you follow up with those folks that have left the church, and do you expect them to follow through in their pledges, and how do you encourage them to follow through? Would you have any good advice on that?
Sure. Well, first, the statistics say most people do complete their pledges. Usually they do. We want to take a very gentle approach and not have any legalistic considerations at all. We want to encourage them to complete a pledge, and we want to inform them on how their pledge will be used. So usually we're pretty lucky in that regard. Information and encouragement seems to win.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Want to summarize or just go to the question?
So I think we're at the end here. I think just a quick summary of, it's really key about, one thing good about a capital campaign is it really, I think, re-energizes the churches, that it really helps them thrive financially, socially, spiritually, as we've heard from Dennis, that, this deep discernment and this deep engagement on the part of parishioners, that this can be a really celebratory time that really can re-energize and rebuild the community if it's done right. If it's not done right, it could have the opposite effect, but it's a wonderful time for that. And I think it really shows that the core of these capital campaigns is all about that consensus decision-making and building the vision beforehand, and engaging parishioners in all aspects of it, from the initial visioning to actually creating the campaign. If everybody's a part of the campaign, and volunteer committees, and helping build out the items in the construction committee, everybody has a gift that they can lead, and the more that people participate, the stronger they're going to be. So Again, there's just a lot of work, but there's a lot of help out there, and clearly Dennis and Church Development has some wonderful resources there, as we do on our website. We do have a one question here, so you want to read that for us?
Sure. The question is, how is producing banners, videos, brochures, prayer guides, and newsletters accomplished? Is it the campaign firm, staff, or a volunteer committee?
Okay, so I'm going to address that, and I got a question that popped up on mine about division of labor too, but let's talk about that. So your question is, how are we going to produce these communication materials? Because it really does take somebody a couple hundred hours. Well, it's kind of rare to have a volunteer who has the time and expertise to create those. My theory is, let us pay to get that done, because if they're not doing a good job, we can fire them and get somebody else. So if a do-it-yourself campaign, it's the communication materials are kind of going to be a challenge. I do recommend you pay for it. And if you hire us, that's one of the things that we do. We have a full-time graphics designer and a writer on staff who produces each of those items, and they're graphically consistent, and they have just immediate turnaround. But whoever asked this question, I mean, you really should be worried, because it really is time consuming, and it does require a level of expertise. And the danger is, if you don't do a professional job, just less gets done. And it is kind of like farming, communication is kind of like water. The less water you put on a tomato plant, the smaller the tomatoes are going to be. So people do have a whole lot of communication. They have information needs, and we all consume that information differently. Some people love Facebook, and it's very inexpensive to put something on there every single day. Some people hate Facebook and will only look at paper. Some people only want something in the bulletin, but statistics say now only 1/3 of your people attend church every Sunday, so the bulletin and announcements don't work. So really, you got to do a comprehensive communication strategy, which is just kind of overwhelming, but you got to do that if you want to raise the maximum amount of money, which is kind of related to the question that I just had pop up, which is, how is that 700 hours that you mentioned earlier allocated? And my advice is to have that be one person who's a pro, and they're the hub of the wheel. Now, you could distribute that. You could have one person, like let's say you have a half-time church business administrator, and they're willing to move from half-time to full-time for 5 months. That could be problem solved right there. Then they only need some coaching on what are the right things to do. That's really a pretty good model right there. But if you don't want to hire a consultant and you don't have a church business administrator, it's pretty tough to get a volunteer to put in that many hours.
So
which kind of goes back to, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, well, we just got 2 more questions here, and I know we're closing up on an hour here, but maybe you could address these 2. The first one is, just given your years of experience, what are 2 trends in capital campaigns that churches should be aware of? Is there kind of a changing paradigm that we have around capital campaigns, based on your experience? And then also, is there an optimum time to launch a capital campaign? Is it in the fall, spring, Easter, Christmas? So can you address those 2 kind of quickly?
Oh, sure. In terms of trends, churches are becoming like colleges, where they're thinking about doing a capital campaign every 5 years. There seems to be no downside. Annual giving actually goes up during a capital campaign if it's done based on engagement and prayer. It's counterintuitive, but that's what the statistics show. Isn't that crazy? So your trend is capital campaign every 5 years. Now, the other question about timing, really our only guide is when to not have a commitment Sunday. And the not is, don't have it in the summertime when everybody has evacuated the church. So June, July, August, don't have a commitment Sunday. Spring and fall are kind of equal. Statistically, there are a few more capital campaign commitment Sundays held in the fall, but you can do just fine with a May commitment Sunday as well. So it's really the better question is, when is our church ready? When's the momentum present itself?
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. I think you want to wrap us up here?
Absolutely. I think really, first of all, we want to thank everyone at Church Development, Dennis and Larry and Meredith, for the tremendous support and for helping us put together these webinars. They've been really fun and hopefully informative and engaging for everybody watching. If you've not been able to watch all of the series, please check out our resources on the diocesan website, episcopalcolorado.org. The resources can be found under congregational resources, and we'll continue building out those resources in line with what you tell us your needs are. And again, thank you for being here today, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.
Thanks. Thanks
Hey,
again.
thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.